majority minority districts, districts that tend to have Black representatives, you know, stay extant as we speak
Mm,
in Louisiana and Florida, possibly in Tennessee. They're redrawing districts, and we're going to have a different looking Congress in come 2027. So whether you like that or not, and you can probably guess where I stand on the Calais versus Louisiana, or Louisiana versus Calais opinion. But I think sort of globally we have these incredibly impactful decisions that are being handed down by the courts. More so, it seems like
mhm,
each passing year. I mean, there was sort of you could say the peak was Bush v. Gore in 2000, and that was my first
mm,
year of college. That was obviously big on campus. And really, since that time, we've sort of had this arrogation of power, this growing amount of power coming from the federal courts. And so, I'm not a Supreme Court justice. There's nothing that I can necessarily do to change that. But, what I think is important is for us to trust that the men and women who hold those seats, the nine justices, as well as the 2,400 lower court judges, let's not forget about them.
mhm,
Important that they are held to a higher ethical standard, that if they're going to have all this power, that we should know more about where they're going in their off time, who they're spending it with, what gifts and reimbursements they're receiving.
mhm,
We should think about how long they're serving and whether or not, to what degree the public should have increased access to their papers and to the courtroom. So that was sort of the idea of Fix the Court, is saying, okay, we have this third branch of government. The judiciary does a terrible job of policing itself, and I'm sure we'll get into examples pretty soon. But my goal is to find ways, and through nonpartisan means. I mean, not a single one of Fix the Court fixes would help one party's justices or judges or another. It's just saying,
right, right.
with all this power comes a greater responsibility, and that means things like divesting from stocks and not accepting so many gifts, and allowing
Mhm,
reporters to show up when you give a talk, on a college campus.
yeah, yeah, and I think, you made an important point there about how Fix the Court, it looks like addresses mainly, issues for the Supreme Court, but it does include the federal courts as well. So can you
Absolutely.
walk us through, you have, or Fix the Court has 6 priorities. Can you can you tell us about each of them and why they're the ones that made your priority list?
Yeah, I mean, so my background is in journalism, is in broadcast journalism. Went to WashU undergrad, Northwestern for grad school for journalism. Was in journalism for a year, didn't love it. Moved to DC, did like consulting, PR, the
Mhm,
policy work, and had several clients that just like randomly ended up having cases in the federal courts. So it was like marriage equality plaintiffs in Maine and
mhm,
California, and voting rights groups in Texas. And it was like, well, we'll just, if our cases make it to the Supreme Court, many of which did, or even when they were in the lower federal courts, oh, we'll just, we'll watch our cases on C-SPAN 4. And like, obviously that's not a thing. It doesn't exist. There are no cameras in the courtroom. There's a couple lower courts. There's 200, more than 200 lower federal courts, and most of them, almost all of them, don't allow cameras, for various reasons. But being able to watch a voting rights case or a same-sex marriage case on the Supreme Court was not possible. So I started a group called the Coalition for Court Transparency in 2012, trying to put me in
mm,
the courtroom. Didn't succeed there, though. We did get live audio, and I think Fix the Court played a small role in that, because we were able to convince then Chief Judge of the DC Circuit, Merrick Garland, to live stream one of his major abortion arguments, or one of the major abortion arguments before his court in 2018, and that sort of led to the. I mean, COVID obviously
okay,
pushed it, but that sort of led to the live streaming
mm,
of audio of the Supreme Court. But when I was a grad student at Northwestern, I just, was a lazy grad student who didn't want to put on a suit and go across the street to cover the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one of the 13 regional appeals courts in the United States. Even though it was across the street, I was like, I should just be able to, this is
mhm,
2006. I had a laptop, I had an internet,
yeah, yeah,
and I shouldn't have had to, So we really started with the first fix being cameras in the courtroom, and both at the Supreme Court and the lower court level. Since we worked with Merrick Garland, we worked with other chief judges. So every federal appeals court, the Supreme Court, and the 13 regional appeals courts, they all live stream their audio, and we update this every month. I have staff doing that, I think, as we speak, and as far as I know, all 14 are still doing that. So that was the first fix, because I think, yes, the most important thing that a court does is the opinion. But in terms of like the one public potential, the interaction between the public
Mhm.
courts, that's during oral argument. That's during, if oral argument is what it's called when it's a proceeding at an appeals court. But or during the trial level, there's obviously voir dire, jury selection, the trial testimony, etc., opening arguments, closing arguments. These all happen in the courtroom. Courtrooms are by nature smaller than can fit everybody that may be
Right.
interested in a case. So there should absolutely be live streaming of audio, or if even better, audio and video. So,
Right.
so that's sort of where I started. And that's doing the Coalition for Court Transparency for 2 years. It's doing these events, and I had events. I had Ken Starr, the former independent counsel in the Clinton era. He was
Mhm.
cameras in the courtroom. The Chief Justice of Ohio, who's also a Republican, was in favor. The former acting Solicitor General, he was. So I did all these events, and then realized it wasn't just this cameras issue that made the federal judiciary so antiquated. So it was also the fact that. So I started thinking, okay, what are the other things? So financial disclosure. All
Yeah.
they didn't have to put their financial disclosures on the internet. Now they do, thanks to us and a few other
Mhm.
groups. The financial disclosure laws are from the post Watergate era, passed in 78, and the justices actually they started doing that in the early 70s, before Watergate. But it became a law in the late 70s, went into effect in the early 80s. They've been putting out these disclosures, and the lower court judges too. But it was such a pain in the butt to get them. I remember having to walk to the Kinkos in Southport when I was living in Chicago to like send a fax to some office in DC, and then maybe like a month later I would get something in the mail that would be like
Oh,
Joe
wow.
disclosure. And like the world doesn't
Yeah.
work that slowly. It didn't work that slowly when I was living in Chicago in 20, I don't know, 14, 15,
Mm.
16. Like it doesn't work that slowly now either. And it didn't work that
Yeah.
slowly in the 90s, frankly. But
And I guess if with as we advance, technologically, the court and other institutions like it are going to be just sort of comfortable doing things the way they always have, unless someone comes along and says, "No,
yep.
times have changed."
Exactly.
What
And that happens in some courts, and there are definitely courts like the Ninth Circuit based in San Francisco. Like they've had cameras in the courtroom for decades, really since about 30 years now they've allowed it.
Mm.
But most of the courts in the rest of the country don't. I talked to a federal judge last night who was, I can't mention who, but he's a trial judge, and he's like, yeah, to the extent possible, like I'd be fine with having cameras in my courtroom. And
Yeah.
the one thing I can tell you about is that he is young. you know, I think he's a few years older. I think he's like maybe late 40s, or maybe in his 50s. I don't know exactly know how, but
Yeah.
he's either Gen. What am I? Millennial? Either
Younger
a
than most of the
millennial or a
justices,
young,
yeah.
yeah, either older millennial or late Gen X.
Yeah.
So, but that's a big part of it, right? If you when the
Mhm.
Supreme Court has justices who are 77 and 76 and
Yeah.
71 and 70, like those are not the people who are going to want cameras in the Supreme Court. I mean, it's so funny.
Mhm.
The quote is, David Souter, a former justice, has said, cameras would roll into the Supreme Court over my dead body. Well, number one, he is dead. Number two, that's not how cameras exist. Cameras are fist size, right? I wish I could put it up here. I don't have it, handy. But I went to a hearing where Justices Kagan and Alito talked about the budget. They were asking for more money from Congress. They had a hearing, and you could see, and I'm sitting behind them, and I took a picture of them, and you could see like above them and to the side of them these like cameras that are this, size of fist. So I like took a picture
Mhm.
and I circled the cameras, and he said, posted it online saying, look, it's not that hard, right? Like cameras are not
Yeah.
intrusive. It's not like, we got screwed by the Lindbergh baby trial, by OJ, by a lot of these sensational
Mhm.
trials where, either the cameras were the size of, giant cabinets, or the judge just did a bad job
Mhm.
of running the show. So, yeah, so we wanted to start there. And then there's also something called Pacer, which is the way you get access to lower federal court records. It costs 10 cents a page just to look at the docket sheet, just to see what things have been filed,
Oh,
motions,
wow.
orders, opinions. And then each page of each of those documents, motions, are cost 10 cents a page just to view as a static PDF or as an HTML file on your computer. So that costs the American people $150 million a year. We're working, that's sort of under the media and public access umbrella. You don't
Yeah.
get an exemption if you're media or a nonprofit or even a Hill staffer or a Department of Justice staffer. You don't get an exemption.
Wow.
So, so we're trying to make that free. There's free it's free at the Supreme Court. Since 2017, the Supreme Court has had a really great free uh,
Mhm.
filing system where you can read all the filings for free. But any federal hearing, I mean, there's one hearing the other day that had like 1,500 docket entries, and luckily, the fee for each thing is capped at $3. So for me to look through to find something only cost me $3, but that adds up very quickly.
Still, yeah.
Especially a group like mine that's like constantly looking. Someone emailed me today, was like, hey, there's this judge that owns a bunch of Dow stock that hasn't reported it on his disclosure. And it's like, okay, well, now I got to look through how many, the judge is in his 70s. I got to look through how many cases to see if
Mm.
Dow has appeared. So, it adds up fast for folks that are interested in trying to do the oversight work
Yeah.
like me.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, which I forgot to do, we just sort of found things that people were interested in, right? It was financial disclosures. It was stock ownership. We think the justices shouldn't own stocks. And as of about
Mhm.
an hour ago, I wrote a letter to the counselor to the chief justice saying that the justices should not be participating in prediction markets because there are prediction markets for different case outcomes.
Mhm.
So we'll see if they respond. But I literally just sent that off to the counselor to the chief justice and the head of the lower courts. This guy named Judge Conrad, who runs the administrative office of the U.S. courts. We'll see what they do because the Senate just banned it, so hopefully they'll ban it as well.
Okay.
Um, we do a justice tracker. Public appearances is one of the fixes because we think that when the justices are appearing in public, now, I mean, I don't care when they're visiting their grandkids, but if they're giving a talk at, Harvard or
Mhm.
Georgetown or, speaking at the First Liberty Institute conference or what have you, I think they should, the public should know about it. I mean,
And
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
that's just another matter of transparency, right? So that we have a view on what they're saying
Exactly.
to
Yeah. We don't
different
want,
outside of the courtroom.
yes, there's Justice Scalia famously said something about you know there was a question of as to the extent to which the phrase "under God" should be in the Pledge of Allegiance, and if people can abstain from saying it or participating in a school event. A school said you had to say it, or a school said you had to, in order to participate in an event, you had to say the full pledge, which included "under God." And Scalia said, well, this case is stupid during one of his talks. And like,
Mm,
whether or not he thought about that, you can't talk about an open case when it's an open case. So he ended
yeah.
up recusing from the case, which was the right call. But we just want to be sure that the justices are not talking out of school and talking
Mhm.
about cases while they're live, but also not appearing at $1,000 a head fundraisers. Right? Justices are
Right,
not
right.
supposed to just. Whoops. Justices are not supposed to appear at fundraisers. So
Mhm.
that's another thing that we look at to see, what's
And
going
is
on.
that something they sometimes do then, is go appear at these fundraisers and then we don't know about it because there isn't any advance notice, or they
Yes,
don't have to give
so
advance?
in terms of advance notice, that's a really good point, right? When I worked for a governor, every night before we left the office, we'd send out a media advisory that says tomorrow the governor will be in Nassau
Mhm.
County doing this, and we'll be in Westchester doing this, and we'll be in Staten Island doing that. Like the justices don't do that, and we only find out
Mhm.
about their appearances if the University of Texas, where Justice Thomas was speaking, happens to send out a release or put out something on social media or put out, and it's like very
Yeah.
painstaking to have to look through it
Figure it
all.
out.
It's really kind of a pain in the butt, but we do it. It's
Yeah.
fixthecourt.com. It's like slash news. It's usually the first news story because they're chronological. So we do
One
that.
of them it one of the goals, one of the 6 goals is, term limits for the
Yes.
Supreme Court justices. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so term limits were really popular and talked about for the first time in a long time in earnest about 20 a little over 20 years ago. So between 1994, Justice Breyer's appointment, and 2005, Chief Justice Roberts' appointment, you had an 11-year period where there was no turnover at the Supreme Court, which was within a few days. I think it ended up being the second longest, but the almost longest period in American history where there was no turnover. And some people like that. I mean, Justice Thomas has spoken fondly of that period where he was very close with his colleagues and not so much
Mm,
nowadays. I don't think that's good, though. What ended up happening is you had this idea of sort of entrenched personalities within the Supreme Court, right? There's this idea of like the Scalia seat and the Ginsburg seat and
mm,
even the Thomas seat. I mean, he's still there. Um, that you have, with this lack of turnover, certain people deserve these seats and can sit there forever. I mean, one of the justices that was there during that period was John Paul Stevens. Like him or hate him, he served for 35 years, and that's really,
mm.
the average time that a justice served prior to 1970 was 16 years. Since then, it's been about 28 years. So
Wow.
I think,
Okay.
given the amount of power that the justices have, the idea that they serve forever on the Supreme Court, first of all, that's not what the founders intended. If we want to go
Mm,
back to why we have term limits, to begin with, it's because England had term limits, and England had term limits because it had a bunch of inbred kings that were firing judges that whose disagreements or whose judgments that they disagreed with.
yeah.
Look this up. There's something called the Act of Parliament in 1701, or there was an Act of Parliament in 1701 that basically established this under during good behavior, which is in our Constitution, says that's when judges and justices shall serve during good behavior, and that's meant to be, or that's been interpreted to be term life tenure. But to me, there's nothing in the Constitution that says life tenure means life
Yeah.
tenure on the highest court in the land. There are other things that a justice can do besides hearing cases as a Supreme Court justice. They can sub in when there's a recusal. They can do administrative things. They can do budget
Mm,
things. They can, as most judges who have retired and not died on the court have done since the law changed in 1937, they can sit on lower courts. If you are a justice of the Supreme Court, you have the ability under a federal law that's almost 90 years old to serve on other courts. Just last month, Justice Breyer, still called justice, right? You look at the text, still
mm,
called justice, wrote an opinion in a case that was heard in the regional circuit based in Boston. So Sandra Day O'Connor
yeah.
famously sat on, I think, every circuit in the country, but most of the justices who have retired that still had their wits about them did this. So I think our term limits plan is you can't. I don't think you can do anything to the nine. I think there's Supreme Court precedent and some federal law that says once you have a federal job, you can't change the parameters of that job once the
Mm, mhm, mhm.
but for new justices, I think you say, look, you're going to be a federal judge for life, 18 years of which is on the Supreme Court. And after that, you can, retire with full salary and benefits as many do. I mean, Justice Souter, for example, retired after 19 years. You can retire with full benefits, or you can
Mhm.
serve on the lower federal courts or sub in when there is a recusal. So every
Yeah.
nine justices, 18 years, 18 divided by nine is two. So that means every 2 years, there would be a new justice added to the court. And that would sort of
Mm.
more
And I
parity.
guess that would yeah, that would give, more of a predictability. That would
Exactly.
mean
Exactly.
that, for example, one president doesn't unless he I guess he serves 2 terms, right,
That's two terms, correct.
isn't going to, nominate an outsized number of justices compared to other presidents.
Yeah, and in the last like century, the only time, I mean, Roosevelt's obviously an outlier, but that's um, we pass an amendment to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But
Mm,
since then, the only time where we've had three successive terms of a president in the single party was Reagan Bush. So
mm,
theoretically, they would have appointed six out of the nine justices. But even Reagan or Clinton or Bush or Obama, they would have
right.
only appointed four out of the nine justices. So no
Mm.
one president would appoint uh, uh, you know uh, would appoint a
More
majority
than
of
others, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the justices that say a Nixon appointed was very different than the justices that a Trump appointed. So
Mhm.
I think that regularity, that predictability, um, poor
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter got zero justices in his 4 years, whereas Trump got three justices in his first 4 years. So
Yeah.
The Republicans and Democrats have won roughly the same number of votes, electoral college votes, presidential votes over the last half century, yet 11 of the last 16 justices have been appointed by Republican presidents. So,
Mhm, mhm.
I, it just sort of evens the playing field moving
Yeah,
forward.
yeah. I imagine there are it was difficult to whittle the goals down to these 6 things, and I'm thinking of some other issues that have been in the news lately, like the shadow docket.
Yeah.
Do you view the shadow can you tell us first what it is? And do you view it as an issue that falls under any of these 6 priorities that you've set? Is it
Sure. Yeah.
something that would be resolved? Yeah.
Yeah. The six categories were just sort of general. Like I spend a ton of time working on workplace conduct issues, right? There's
Mhm.
unfortunately been a lot of harassment, discrimination, retaliation in the federal judiciary, and we need to work to ensure that the men and women who work there have the same protections that you or I or anybody who works, say, in Congress have, and they don't. They don't have the same protections in federal law, so that doesn't really fit in with maybe under code of
Yeah.
ethics, but there are definitely things we do that don't necessarily fit under those six. And we didn't even start with term limits because back in 2014 when we started, we weren't sure was it bipartisan. Initially, it was very heavily pro on the Republican side and very anti on the Democratic side. Obviously, it switched a little bit. Now it's like 75% of Democrats and 70% of Republicans. But when we started, it was like, well, I don't know if we want to add this if only one side of the coin likes it, right? And I think
Mhm, mhm,
we added it and it was fine. But in terms of the shadow docket, look, the Supreme Court gets 5,500 petitions every year, and it has to dispose of them. The vast majority of them are not granted, right? 99% of them are not granted, and they're disposed of in orders. It says review is denied in the following 100 cases. They come out with an orders list every Monday. But sometimes they get these cases where there's a supposed emergency. It's a petition from either a litigant, a person, a company, the government from the court below, and
mhm,
they said, "Look, we're in an emergency posture. You need to act quickly." In the Supreme Court, very quickly, it goes to usually one justice who oversees a regional circuit court, and then they'll typically send it to their colleagues. The justices will, can very quickly, without a full briefing, without looking at what the merits are, without amicus briefs, without really thinking about it, can just sort of jot off a decision, and there's no requirement that they explain that decision. They can just say,
mhm,
"Well, we're putting a stay on this policy," or we are, even though the district court and the circuit court said, "No, President Trump, you can't do this policy. We're going to stay the lower court's opinions and allow President Trump's policies to temporarily go into effect."
mhm,
So the problem with that is that a lot of these emergency petitions don't have a temporary impact. If you are a Haitian or a Syrian who is here on temporary protected status, you could theoretically be deported during
mhm.
the time in which that shot the shadow docket just means it wasn't the normal merits and briefs and oral argument. There's only about 60 cases a year, so any sort of
Right.
major case that's issued in a
And
interim.
even if the decision was meant to be temporary to get us to the next milestone, say, if someone's deported as a result of that
Yeah.
decision, then there's no going back for it
Yeah, or you
for
spend
them.
money on a tariff, or
Mhm,
you lose your job, right? A lot of the more recent shadow docket cases have been dealing with executive branch um, personnel. And just on my block, like looking out my window, you got VOA, ODNI, State Department. Everywhere in West Falls Church, like on my little street, we got half of the people work for the government. Some of them were
mhm.
laid off, some of them were not. I think yeah, the husband was the wife or the vice whatever it was. Like it's not temporary. Like even if they
Yeah,
get their
yeah,
jobs back, will they get back pay? Maybe. They should if they, but there are decisions that you have
yeah,
to make. Mortgage payments. It's not like
right.
your mortgage is temporarily stayed by the Supreme Court. So, you know, I, I think that this sort of like, waving the hand that certain justices have done in recent public appearances of any sort of culpability of like, oh, we're just waiting for it to percolate. We don't. So just leave what the lower courts did. Trust
Mm,
your
mhm.
colleagues. A lot of times, these decisions have, they reach the shadow docket, but there's still been a trial, or there's still been, some amount of fact finding by a lower court judge to the,
Yeah.
discriminatory or intent or impact of a certain policy. I think that sort of washing their hands of it is really just weak and not, is a little gaslighty for me. These are,
Yeah.
temporary. They might come back. You're right. These cases are very likely to come back, but maybe not till 2027, maybe
Yeah.
not till
Yeah.
2028. So
And they're affecting people's lives right now.
exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
the challenge is there's not a huge amount that can be done about this, right? I mean, I think Congress, the Supreme, what is it called? The Shadow Light Transparency Act that we worked on with Senator Blumenthal's office and Congresswoman Ross's office. It would say, justices need to explain their reasoning for X, Y, and Z. Fine, okay, and even frankly, the bill didn't have any Republican sponsors; it wasn't going to pass. But the justices have, in certain instances, not all instances, but in certain instances, done a better job of explaining some of their shadow docket
Mm.
uh, uh, orders. But like,
It
unless
still,
you're
I guess, lacks that transparency that is one
yes,
of your central goals, right?
exactly, and the
Yeah.
challenge is like, unless you're threatening to take away the justice's jurisdiction on certain issues, or you're threatening their
Mm.
budget, there's not a whole lot. Like, there needs to be a shadow docket, right? Like, there is going to always be, so long as we have a country that loves putting other people to death, an emergency docket for the death penalty cases. Is always going to
Mm.
be a last minute attempted clemency from the governor, or a last minute attempted clemency from the justices. There were two, just yesterday, and like, I'm not really sympathetic to either. I think uh, but that's still a part of what the
Yeah.
justices do. And if they issued a stay, the stay would be issued on the shadow docket. So like, there still is
Mm.
an emergency docket, whatever you want to call it. So there still is a need to have some sort of way to deal with emergencies. Unfortunately, I just don't think that a large percentage of the emergencies that are arising under the Trump administration are actual emergencies. Number one.
Mm.
Number two, I think the justices should be giving greater deference to the lower courts, who 8 times out of 10 are saying, no, Trump administration, you're overstepping your executive power. You need to chill out
Mm.
a moment. And the fact that the Supreme Court is allowing those
Mm.
executive orders and whatnot to go back into effect, I think is just a real kick in the balls to the rest of the branch.
Well said. Um, well, can you tell us how we can follow your work and if there are ways that our viewers can get involved in your efforts?
Yeah, sure. So, we're fixthecourt.com. I'm just, Gabe at fixthecourt.com, wyword.com and not.org. Don't know, but that's what the URL was when we got it 12 years ago. We're on X and Blue Sky, and I mean, I think we were on Facebook, but that's not worth dealing with these days. I mean, neither is
Mm.
X or Blue Sky. I mean, none of them are great, but they're all awful in their own sort of various ways. But yeah, I mean, in terms of getting involved, I mean, I think, to me, I think it's always, there are 94 federal district courts in the country. And I think it's useful to sort of understand who the judges are. You can look them all up. Every court has a website. I live in the
Mm.
Eastern District of Virginia. The main courthouse is in Alexandria. I know the judges who are there. I can download their financial disclosures from federal. There's a federal database called Jeffs, which stands for, like, I forget what the J is, judiciary, but some sort of financial disclosure database that you can Google. It's the one database that exists. And so, be familiar with that, sort of understand the local rules, go to court, right? If there's a case that's coming up that you see on the docket that you want live streaming of, send them an email, right? Every judge in
Mm.
the country is first underscore last at the name of the court.uscourts.gov. So, ask the clerk, ask the judge for live streaming for if you, if, if, uh, you, if, uh, you want to. And, I think, I think, you know, having that sort of insight into your local court is, sort of the best way to keep them honest.
Yeah. Yeah, and pushing for that transparency, I think if more people, were doing that, then it would probably make your job a lot easier.
Yeah, yeah, no, and we just pretty much do federal courts. I mean, most of the 90% of the courts in the country are not federal courts. They're state courts, they're local
Mhm.
courts, they're municipal courts, they're county courts, and they have their own issues. I know. I mean, Fiona Apple during COVID got really interested in watching her local court because it happened to be on TV, and there was some issues with judges setting bonds and bails too high, and then she started her own organization. I mean, like that's how
Mm.
she passed her time during COVID. Great. I mean, I wish more people did that locally. I think she's in somewhere in Maryland. Um, but yeah, getting to know your local federal court. Like I said, there's 94 district courts in the country. If you happen to live in, San Francisco, Denver, New Orleans, Atlanta, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, or St. Louis. I'm probably leaving one out. Or DC. Oh, that's right. You can go to the regional federal court and watch them, and they'll, similar idea. But I think just, everyone is constantly focused on the Supreme Court, which I think is very important.
Mhm.
But, just remember there are 200 other federal courts out there that, could use.
Yeah.
And the way we get to 200, I'm including the bankruptcy courts. Bankruptcy courts are federal courts. So it's the one plus the 13 regional courts plus the 94 district courts plus the 90 bankruptcy courts. That's just in case anyone wanted to.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. I was not doing the math, but I'm sure someone
We're,
watching.
we're, we're like tallying up the justices' gifts over the last 20 years. So it's been a lot of math. It's been a lot of math over here. You can guess who's number one, but you'll never guess. Clarence Thomas.
Yeah. Yeah, I figured. Well, thank you so much, Gabe. Again, it's Fix the Court, and, I really appreciate you telling us about it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to chat.
All right, bye. Oh, and, see you next time. It's gadflycity.com, and don't forget you can watch us on YouTube and Substack. Bye.